This lecture is in memory of Damodar Dharmanand Kosambi, a Marxist historian specializing in ancient India who employed the historical materialist approach in his work. He is particularly known for his classical work, An Introduction to the Study of Indian History, and is described as the patriarch of the Marxist school of Indian historiography. This lecture is titled The History of Black Marxism in the USA and will be delivered by Professor Kipton Jensen. This lecture will be chaired by Professor Dipankar Gupta. May I request the speaker and the chair to please come on stage. Patna-born Dipankar Gupta, a leading sociologist, has had a diverse career in academics, the corporate world, and in government agencies. Between 1980 and 2009, he was a professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University's Center for the Study of Social Systems. He has held many appointments and fellowships in universities in North America, Europe, and UK. He led KPMG's Business Ethics and Integrity Division in New Delhi and was a member of the National Security Advisory Board and the News Broadcasting Standards Authority. Professor Gupta, may I request you to take over the proceedings?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here to chair this session by Professor Jensen. It's on a short history of black Marxism in USA. This should immediately attract all of us because Professor Jensen is not going to just talk about black Americans, about Afro-Americans, but black Americans in general, and about the long struggle from slavery to civil war to civil rights. He is a professor of philosophy at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, which is a very well-known, how should I put it, historically black college. Today, given the Black Lives Matter movement as well, I'm sure all of what Professor Jensen has to say will have much contemporary relevance. Professor Jensen, maybe we can schedule, say, half an hour, okay? And I'll do this to you. Thank you.
Good morning. It's nice to see each of you. Thank you for coming to this session. I want to begin by thanking Lord Professor Desai and the other members of the committee for their hospitality and hard work. I really feel honored to be here with you. I respect those colleagues who can talk their way through their paper. I can't respect myself in that way. I can't do it. So I'm going to read selected portions of my paper. I'll start slow and then pick up the pace as we go along. I and several of my colleagues are here from Morehouse College, and our most luminous alumnus is Martin Luther King, who came to India in 1959. And reflecting on that, and at his first talk, he said, "To other countries I may go as a tourist, but to India I come as a pilgrim." He was speaking in particular, I suppose, of Gandhi. But I think there's more than Gandhi to India, and so I'm learning here too, and I feel honored to be here. Recognition of difference and conflictual social relationships constitute methodological starting point and of anti-oppression theorists. These range from critical race and post-colonial scholars to traditional as well as heterodox Marxists. Exploitation is one of these conflictual social relations, to be sure, but so too are alienation and oppression. The capitalist system in particular, and competitive culture in general, depends upon the separation, if not conflict, between individuals. This essay demonstrates, I trust, how racialized differences in the USA have been used to suppress freedom. Nikhilpal Singh suggests that while there are important exceptions, thinkers in the Marxist tradition have largely failed to give sustained and sympathetic attention to this issue, namely the role of racism in the history of capitalism. This frustration with how the American left has, quoting now, regulated the struggle of blacks to a subsidiary position in the revolutionary movement reaches back at least as far as Hubert Harrison. In recent years, at least in the USA, writes Bacon, Marxism is often acknowledged but circumvented, dismissed for its apparent tendency to emphasize class relations and economic materiality to the exclusion of other forms of oppression and the ways of understanding domination. And while some declare an inherent incompatibility of Marxist perspective and consistent anti-racism, for example, Cedric Robinson, or that Marxism should be rejected as Eurocentric and the victim of Orientalism, Said, Bacon believes, citing many Marxists who are both race and gender theorists, that the divide is by no means definitive. Keeanga Taylor, for one, perhaps as an exemplar, sees racism as through the lens of class, and class with an eye fixed on racism. Because of the gross inequality it produces, writes Taylor, capitalism requires various political, social, and ideological tools to divide the majority. Racism is one among many oppressions intended to serve this purpose. Malcolm X put his finger on the problem most concisely in 1964 at the founding rally of the OAAU, when he quipped, "You can't have capitalism without racism." Also, scholars like Zarelli and Lacau argue that there is no trans-historical group that can stand in for the universal, and that an appropriate signifier must be determined in each period by political contestation. There are nevertheless compelling reasons for focusing on the history of slavery and the ideology of racism as a critical reflection of the brutal dialectics of class struggle in the USA. The historiographical epicycle of black Marxism in the USA over the past 200 years is a singular signifier for a universal struggle for freedom and equality in America. Angela Davis would have us construe slavery as the most extreme form of unfreedom, the reality rather than the metaphor, slave ownership rather than the slavery of wage labor. The analogy or simile is instructive, but the ways that slavery is disanalogous to wage labor is also meaningful. Although one could limit the term black Marxism to Marxists who are black, I wish to use black Marxism in a broader sense of a hermeneutical turn in American historiography. Following Dawson and Badu, I want to regain a political constituted definition of blackness that is less the demand of a social faction or community to be integrated into the existing order than something which touches on the transformation of the order as a whole. Charles Mills is surely right to suggest that, quoting, "In understanding the workings of a system of oppression, a perspective from the bottom is much more likely to be accurate than the one from the top down." Better yet is Angela Davis's observation in her 1969 Lectures on Liberation that the collective consciousness of an oppressed people entails an understanding of the conditions of oppression and the possibility of abolishing those conditions. In this essay, I focus on 5 periods: 1818, 1868, 1918, 1968, and 2018, as illustrative of what might be called the Kosambi model, of presenting in chronological and successive developments of means and relations of production. A historiographical model in which, as Kosambi termed it, citing E.H. Carr, to learn about the present in light of the past also means to learn about the past in light of the present. My first section, the State of the Union in 1818, Slavery and the Rosy Dawn of Capitalism. Quoting from Singh, Atlantic slavery was the cornerstone of capitalist exploitation, appropriation, and dispossession over centuries. It also bequeathed an enduring devaluation of black life. When Marx was born in Triers in 1818, slavery was the law of the land in America. Approximately 12.5 million enslaved Africans were transported to America between 1500 and 1866. 10.7 million survived the dreaded Middle Passage. Alongside the horrors of chattel slavery, which was well established in the U.S. by 1818 and often justified along similar ideological lines, the exponential accumulation of capital entailed or included the slaughter and dispossession of Native Americans. For some, these atrocities comprised two sides of a wooden nickel. Kienga Taylor defines capitalism as an economic system based on the exploitation of the many by the few. In Black Marxism, Cedric Robinson defines racial capitalism in this way: the development, organization, and expansion of capitalist society pursued essentially in racial directions. So too did social ideology. As a material force, then, it could be expected that racism would inevitably permeate the social structures emergent from capitalism. Marx saw quite clearly that capitalism came into the world dripping from head to toe in blood, and also that the turning of Africa into a commercial warren for the hunting of black skin signaled the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. Marable Manning in 2000 claimed that the ordeal of slavery was responsible for accelerating the economic and political power of Europe and North America over the rest of the mostly non-white world. In 1818, 200 years ago, America was still quite young. 50 years earlier, the U.S. was herself a British colony. Frederick Douglass took some small amount of consolation in the fact that America was so young. In 1852, since youth inspires the hope, if not the promise, of maturation and mutual recognition in the trenches, if not also reconciliation and redemption at the mountaintop. In his oration at the Corinthian Hall, Frederick Douglass adumbrated and admonished the glaring inconsistencies inherent in singing paeans to freedom and prosperity on Independence Day, July 4th. On July 5th, in a speech at Corinthian Hall, he said, "The existence of slavery in this country brands your republicanism as a sham, your humanity as a base pretense, and your Christianity as a lie. It destroys your moral power abroad. It corrupts your politicians at home. It saps the foundation of religion. It makes your name a hissing and a byword for the mocking earth." The first 5 presidents of the United States owned slaves. Apteker describes the solidarity exhibited amongst the slaveholders and planter caste in the first half of the 19th century as, quoting, "the most closely knit and most important single economic unit in the nation. There are millions of bondsmen and millions of acres of land comprising an investment of billions of dollars. This economic might had its counterpart in political power, given its possessors dominance within the nation and predominance within the South. 200 years ago, back in 1818, racial domination was explicit, if not unabashed, and a brutal element of the plantocratic management of capitalist society. We sometimes think that for Marx, wage labor emerged from the dissolution of slavery or serfdom and was a precondition of bourgeois society. But slavery also existed within bourgeois society. It is in this sense that Singh amends Marx's axiomatic statement, capital ceases to be capital without the ongoing differentiation of free labor and slavery, wage labor and unpaid labor, as its general creative basis. Beyond the hyper-exploitation inherent in racial differentiation, we would do well also to discuss alienation. The narrative of Frederick Douglass describes slavery as something worse than merely the exploitation of black labor. For Douglass, slavery represented a totalizing claim on the lives of black people. The most extreme form of human alienation, writes Angela Davis, is the reduction of persons to the status of property. The consequences of slavery are still with us today. Indeed, Manning Marable goes so far as to say that since the demise of slavery, the emergence of modern capitalism, the process of black underdevelopment has expanded and deepened. I'll read a quick quote from Manning Marable on underdevelopment, given what was said in the last session. Underdevelopment is not the absence of development. It is the inevitable product of an oppressed population's integration into the world market economy and political system. Once freed, black Americans were not compensated for their 246 years of free labor to this country's slave oligarchy. Sharecropping and convict leasing were followed by industrial labor and low wages. The constant expropriation of surplus value created by black labor is the heart and soul of underdevelopment. Now to 1868 and the Reconstruction Period. The dominant ideology, says Cedric Robinson, was that of the plantocracy, a dictator of labor and land with no democratic pretensions. In 1868, 150 years ago, 5 years subsequent to the Emancipation Proclamation in the U.S., the year of the 14th Amendment was passed. In the wake of the Civil War, the year that W.E.B. Du Bois was born, the year that Marx published the first volume of Capital, in London, 20 years after the publication of Communist Manifesto, the free labor of the enslaved was abolished de jure, but African Americans were still not free. For the emancipated slave, thought Marx, the capitalist relationship appears to be an improvement upon one's position on the social scale. And it was. But Marx also believed that wage labor constitute enslavement of a different sort. In 1855, Douglass observed that by encouraging enmity of the poor laboring white man against the blacks, slaveholders and overlords of a similar type succeeded in making the white man almost as much a slave as the black man himself. De facto slavery did not disappear in 1868. Similar to what Marx called the unending circle of capitalism, the racial capitalist political economy characteristic of the antebellum period was preserved and reproduced in various ways in postbellum America. In their address of the International Working Men's Association, written in November 1864, just 1 year before Lincoln was assassinated, Marx wrote to Lincoln, saying, "The working classes of Europe understood at once, even before the fanatic partisanship of the upper classes for the Confederate gentry, that given its dismal warning, that the slaveholders' rebellion was to sound the tocsin for a general holy crusade of property against labor, and that for the men of labor, with their hopes for the future, even their past conquests were at stake in that tremendous conflict on the other side of the Atlantic." And here's what President Lincoln's representative wrote back. Nations do not exist for themselves alone, but to promote the welfare and happiness of mankind by benevolent intercourse and example. It is in this relation that the United States regard their cause in the present conflict with slavery, maintaining insurgents as the cause of human nature, and they derive new encouragements to preserve from the testimony of the working men of Europe that the national attitude is favored with their enlightened approval and earnest sympathies. Though Marx and Lincoln would have disagreed on other fronts, they did seem to agree that labor rather than capital was the source of value, and that exploitation was abominable. Cedric Robinson writes this: the contradictions within Southern society, rather than a revolutionary vanguard, knit these phenomena into a historical force. After the war, a different ordering would be required to integrate these phenomena into a political movement. This could be accomplished if only the ruling ideologies of society were transcended. This they were not. Du Bois certainly respected Marx's insight into economic relations, plus his observations about the alienation inherent in capitalist modes of production. But he also thought that Marx was a product, Du Bois thought that Marx was a product of his own place and time. Though appreciative of Marx, who Du Bois must have understood quite well given his studies in Berlin, Du Bois said he never felt obliged, quoting, to dogmatize with Marx or Lenin. Reprinted in Moon as the Negro and Racial Thought. In Marx and the Negro, written in 1933, Du Bois wrote, "It is a great loss to American Negroes that the great mind of Marx and his extraordinary insight into industrial conditions could not have been brought to bear at first hand upon the history of the American Negro between 1876 and the World War. Whatever he said and did concerning the uplift of the working class must, therefore, be modified so far as Negroes are concerned by the fact that he had not studied firsthand their particular race problem here in America." What really constituted historical forces during the period in question? Good. Thought Du Bois was animated by the ideologies. What really constituted the historical forces during the period in question, thought Du Bois, was the ideologies of race and individualism rather than a conscious contradiction between the modes of production and the relations of production. In America, at least, thought Du Bois, racism constituted a historical force that precluded the emergence of a strong labor movement. What really happened, according to Du Bois, what obstructed class consciousness and solidarity, was racial capitalism. By 1918, Du Bois himself criticized the American Socialist Party's ideologues for praising the successes of Russian peasantry while ignoring the achievements of American blacks. The economic foundation for class antagonism was challenged during this period by proposals that would radically alter land tenure. Robinson says the white ruling class averted this change in land tenure by getting poor whites to scapegoat and chastise the black workers. Okay, now I'll quickly move ahead to the State of the Union in 1918, where I'll speak for a moment about Eugene Debs. Hubert Harrison in 1911 wrote, "Politically, the Negro is the touchstone of the modern democratic ideal." One approach to discussing the racial capitalism during this period consists in contrasting W.E.B. Du Bois and Eugene Debs. This is what David Rodiger does, or attempts to do, in Class, Race, and Marxism. The tact was taken by him earlier in 2006. Du Bois claimed, famously, that the great issue of the 20th century was the color line. And yet, the leading voice of socialists, if not Marxists, of the period, Eugene Debs, who was jailed twice and who ran for president behind bars in 1920, claimed that, and this is the innuendo in question, the socialist movement in America, as distinct from the Communist Party USA, which was founded in 1919, could and probably should offer nothing special to African Americans. Debs added that the class struggle is colorless. But, not altogether unlike Du Bois in 1918, Harrison argued that supporting African Americans was the crucial test of socialism's sincerity. Robinson would have us focus on Lenin as the person who best understood the strategic value of recruiting African Americans into the party. In 1922, at the Fourth International Committee, in his missive titled The Negro Question, as defending the principle of self-determination, which Lenin supported. But already in 1903, and subsequently in 1904, Eugene Debs quipped that it would jeopardize the best in 1903, in response to someone he calls Mr. Anonymous, who wrote to criticize his views on the Negro question, where he implored American socialists to suggest absolute equality. Mr. Anonymous wrote, "It would jeopardize the best interest of the Socialist Party if you insisted on political equality for the Negroes." So this was a struggle in the American Socialist Party, but also in the Communist Party later, the extent to which to emphasize race would undermine class solidarity. And I think that's an ongoing story. And that happens, I think, in intersectional ways also. That if we're talking about class struggle, some people don't want to talk about race. Or if we're talking about class struggle, we don't want to talk about gender, as if it would somehow undermine our solidarity. Some would contend that Debs wasn't really a Marxist at all. V.F. Calverson wrote that Debs's Marxism, if it could be called such, was more instinctual than intellectual. Not unlike Marx, Debs's critique of capitalism began with a sober recognition that those who produce should have, but we know that those who produce the most, that is, those that work the hardest and the most difficult and most menial tasks, have the least. Debs seemed to have intellectually understood the role of racial ideologies in America and elsewhere in arresting or otherwise retarding the evolutionary or teleological development towards class consciousness and revolutionary solidarity. Debs believed, both early and late, that it was only through an organizing struggle in the labor and socialist movement that the Negro would win equality. Similar to Debs' 1918 commemoration lecture honoring Marx 100 years ago, I'm keen to focus on the matter of the man than the particular theories he espoused. Debs conceded that no tongue or pen could possibly do Marxism justice. But Debs came pretty close in his own description of Marx when he described him in 1918 as a triumphant awakener of the long asleep and the revolutionary leader of the long enslaved masses. Debs first read Das Kapital in an Illinois jail where he was imprisoned in 1895 for his role in the Pullman strike. Instructive parallels can be drawn between Marx and Debs, to be sure, but it's also true, as Thoreau says, that the Mississippi was a Rhine stream of a different sort. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about Satyagraha in 1918 and parallel movements here in India, but I think I have to skip ahead, and I hope that we find ways to talk about this later on. I'll move to 1968 very quickly. Malcolm X, at about this time, before he was assassinated though, but in the 60s, said, "The oppressed people of this earth make up a majority, not the minority." And here, a quick quote from Langston Hughes, who was one of those few African Americans who traveled to the Soviet Union and other places, that justice is a blind goddess, is a thing to which we blacks are wise. Her bandage hides two festering sores that once, perhaps, were eyes. By 1960, the year that Martin Luther King was assassinated as part of the sanitation workers' strike in Memphis, Tennessee, African Americans were still not free. Many, if not most, African Americans were, as King put it in 1966, trapped in an airtight cage of poverty. By 1968, Howard Thurman, and Martin Luther King were reconsidering, yet consistently devoted to the methods of nonviolent yet active resistance against social and economic justice, whether racism or poverty or militarism. The closest we came to a truly revolutionary position was perhaps in 1968, the Poor People's Campaign. King was advocating for the basic living wage 50 years ago. In the past 50 years, things have perhaps not improved that much. Marable Manning wrote, "The citadel of the world capitalism, the United States, has never liked to admit that millions of its citizens are poor." In one of his final speeches before returning to Memphis, celebrating 100 years since the birth of W.E.B. Du Bois in Atlanta, in a speech titled Honoring Du Bois, in 1968, Martin Luther King said, "We must finally admit that Du Bois was brilliant and he was also a communist." Du Bois died in Ghana in 1963, on the very day that King was delivering his I Have a Dream speech, which was originally titled Normalcy Never Again. The underlying conditions from 1868, 1918, and 1968 remain the same, essentially, or at the very least they betray family resemblances when it comes to what King called the ugly triplets, namely racism, poverty, and militarism. It's become fashionable to discuss the radical King, though it is sometimes suggested that King abandoned his commitment to active yet nonviolent resistance, which is not true. It is true that King was increasingly committed to addressing structural inequalities rather than relying on moral persuasion to combat what he called the ugly triplets, racism, materialism, and militarism. King was increasingly convinced that the goals of labor and the goals of African Americans were one and the same. In his seminal All Labor Has Dignity, earlier on in a passage that King amends when it comes to honoring Du Bois in 1968, King concluded, and I know I'm running short of time, but this is such a fantastic quote, I want to share it with you. Dr. Du Bois's greatest virtue was his committed empathy with all the oppressed and his divine dissatisfaction with all forms of injustice. Today we are still challenged to be dissatisfied. Let us be dissatisfied until every person can have food and material necessities for his or her body, culture and education for his or her mind, freedom, and until rat-infested, vermin-filled slums will be a thing of a dark past and every family will have a decent, sanitary house in which to live. Let us be dissatisfied until the empty stomachs of Mississippi are filled and the idle industries of Appalachia are revitalized. Let us be dissatisfied until brotherhood is no longer a meaningless word at the end of a prayer, but the first order of business at every legislative agenda. Let us be dissatisfied until our brother or sister in the third world, Asia, Africa, or Latin America will no longer be the victim of imperialist exploitation, but will be lifted from the long night of poverty, illiteracy, and disease. Let us be dissatisfied until this pending cosmic elegy will be transformed into a creative psalm of peace, and justice will roll down like waters from a mighty stream. As early as 1951, but he was increasingly convinced. King made so bold to declare, "I am convinced that capitalism has seen its best days in America." And not only in America, but the entire world. It is a well-known fact that no social institution can survive when it has outlived its usefulness. This capitalism has done. It has failed to meet the needs of the masses. Okay, I'll skip to the conclusion. Okay? How much have things changed? in the US, in India, across the world, since the birth of Marx 200 years ago, or even since 1968, 50 years ago, in terms of racial discrimination and poverty. As a critical race theorist, but also a Marxist of a certain sort, Charles Mills challenged us to recognize that race is central to the making of the modern world, and that, echoing Marx's fine distinction, the now famous 11th thesis of Feuerbach, es kommt darauf an, die Welt nicht nur zu interpretieren, sondern auch sie zu verändern. We must seek, in this Mills, to understand structures of social oppression from the emancipatory purpose of transforming them. I want to conclude with a paragraph or two devoted to Kosambi's application of Marxism to historiography in India. Kosambi defined history as the presentation in chronological order of successive developments in the means and relations of production. In his exasperating essays, Kosambi defined historiography a bit differently. I think that Kosambi would ask us to carefully consider the plight of the most exploited and the least free in 2018, in the US, in India, in Africa. But he would also have us recognize the material and ideological forces that conspire to perpetuate systems of domination, whether in terms of caste, race, gender, or sexual orientation. Analogies have been drawn in the past between, for example, the Dalit population in India and the plight of black people in America. In 1946, Ambedkar drew the analogy in a letter that he wrote to W.E.B. Du Bois. In 1959, when visiting a school in India, Martin Luther King was introduced by the principal as a fellow untouchable from the United States. Although initially shocked and peeved, King later recalled that as he began to think about the fact that 20 million of his brothers and sisters were still smoldering in an airtight cage of poverty in an affluent society. And as I thought about this, he said, I finally said to myself, yes, I am an untouchable, and every Negro in America is an untouchable. Frederick Douglass admonished the black intelligentsia back in 1852 that they should have to do with the past only as they can make it useful to the present and to the future. This essay sought to understand the past, 1818, 1868, 1918, 1968, but also 2018, because it's still relevant. Kosambi occasionally cited Carr to clarify what he took to be the political function of history. To learn about the present in light of the past also means to learn about the past in light of the present. The function of history is to promote a profounder understanding of both past and present through the interrelationship between them. In closing, let us also recall Du Bois's wise dictum in Black Reconstruction that concealing the facts and distorting what actually happens render it easy for a muddled world out of sheer ignorance to make the same mistake 10 times over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jensen. It was a wonderful talk, and I had learned a lot from it. 200 years, you've covered 200 years, and yet so little has changed. And we thought that history was moving fast these days. We have about 5 minutes left, so I invite some questions from the floor. 1, 2, okay. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Shashwat Gautam. I work at ADRI. Quick question related to Marxian ideas and the conflict of the Black Lives Movement in the contemporary times. So how do you see the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement from a Marxist framework and its relationship with class struggle and Marxian economic ideas? And I did see that you stumbled upon the race, class, and gender aspect of it, but if you can expand it a bit more, it will be really helpful. Thank you.
Yes, I'm Peter Udis. Thank you for an excellent presentation. As I'm sure you're aware, one of the sharpest critics within American Marxism of the Eugene Debs thesis that there is no race question outside the class question were C.L.R. James and his associates Raya Dunayevskaya and Grace Lee Boggs in the Johnson-Forrest tendency of the 1940s, who argued completely against that in fact the race question... I'm sorry, you can't hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay, let me start again. As you're probably aware, one of the sharpest critics of the Debsian thesis that there is no race question outside the class question was the work of C.L.R. James, along with his colleagues Raya Dunayevskaya and Grace Lee Boggs, in the Johnson-Forrest tendency of the 1940s, who argued against Debs' thesis that the struggle against racism, and racism in particular itself, were the inner core of capital accumulation in the United States, and argued for the independent development of the black struggle from, and not being reducible to the class struggle. At the same time that they're doing this work, they're the first American Marxists to be reading and translating the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, and the first ones to start talking about the humanism of Marx. So what I'm interested in your views of, is there a connection between the two? Does grasping the proper relationship between race and class and refuting the notion that Marxism is reducible to a theory of class struggle, does that open the door to a completely new reading of Marx himself that traditional orthodox Marxists have failed to be sensitive to?
Hi. Two questions that are related to one another. I guess I wonder, obviously no one can consider the caste question in India as a matter of national self-determination. There could be no question of the national self-determination of Dalits. They're clearly Indians. And the caste formulating...
Just one moment, please. I think we need a different mic for you. We can't hear you out here.
You can't hear me now? Should I hold it closer? Is that better? Or a different mic? Okay. So I'm saying that to treat race as a color caste question is inherently to not frame it as a question of national liberation, it seems to me. And in that way, the analogy with the caste question in India holds true. Just as the caste question in India could never be formulated as a question of national liberation. So I'm wondering about the tension between those two frameworks in American Marxism. And secondarily, I'm wondering in what ways has the question, to the extent that the black struggle in America has been framed as one of national self-determination, how that has changed since the 19th century into the Garveyite movement and then in the 1960s. How is that framework really much more historically variable than perhaps we sometimes recognize it to be?
Okay. And thank you for the questions. And I write too much and present too slowly. But part of the push is to show that, in fact, that even in present day in the USA, that there are some people who are doing both race theory and Marxist theory together. One example of that, an exemplar, the person I mentioned, is Kienga Taylor, who wrote a book just 2 years ago called From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. And in the 7th chapter, she develops the idea that in fact Marxist analysis will lay bare a lot of the invisible strings of oppression that we're still dealing with. And so I think that it's at least noteworthy that it's contested ground. that there are many of those who are working on race theory who are exasperated with Marxist theorists who have failed to recognize the importance of the race issue. I think that's also true for some feminist theorists, that they're frustrated that somehow their interests have to be relegated or subjugated to issues of class consciousness. And I understand that point. In the first wave of feminism in the USA, I suppose that class and color had to be ignored for the sake of solidarity in order to get the vote. And I think that that logic has still been there. And I think traditionally within the American Socialist Party and also the Communist Party USA, that it was assumed that in order to get as quickly as we can to class struggle, to class consciousness and revolution, that we have to downplay the differences among the working class. So it was more about seeing African Americans as members of the proletariat and to the extreme. So I think that that was a political decision about how to do that. I think that in later waves of feminism and race theory that there's some suggestion that that intersectionality is actually helpful, that it doesn't really undermine solidarity, that it lends texture and meaning to the depth of the struggle and opens up possibilities for analogies in various ways of oppressing and looking for the common denominators between them in order that we might work strategically to remove them. So I think that it takes us too far, and I have several colleagues from Morehouse here who are speaking later and who will be happy also to discuss with you and others about how the Black Lives Matter movement now has gained some, can be understood in helpful ways along Marxist lines. But I know that's an inadequate answer to the question. It is true that some of you may have been expecting that I wouldn't talk about Eugene Debs in 1918, that I would be talking about those members, African Americans who were participating in the American Socialist movement earlier on, and the Communist Party USA later, and the individuals who went there, Langston Hughes among them, but others, Harrison, who I mentioned, or Boggs, also Grace Boggs, and those individuals who were very explicit in their adherence to Marxism. But what I've tried to do is to open the door and to show that it's a question of values and concerns, and that even though we quickly dismiss someone like Eugene Debs as saying that in fact he insisted that the only solution for the Negro problem for African Americans to achieve is the labor movement and to find their solidarity as a minority with the working people of the world. And I think that was a movement in various things. For example, the Garvey movement. 1918, he was writing himself that it's very important that African Americans stop thinking of themselves as a minority and to think instead of themselves as a majority. And I think that was increasingly the movement. So I think the intersectionality can thicken it, and not just race, class, and gender, but also sexual orientation and other forms of oppression and domination and power dynamics. So I think we can work that out. And then very quickly to Spencer's question about the nationalism and the ways in which we can cast that. It's actually very interesting that African Americans were advocating for their participation in American socialism in the beginning, in the time of Debs, and maybe Debs was the most sympathetic of the party, those in the party. And the Communist Party, for example, that there was mixed relationship. At a time in the United States where there was a nationalist movement and an attempt, say, for example, with Garvey, to get out of the United States, that the only place that an African American could find respect is outside the United States, which is not to say that all other places are welcoming, but that it couldn't happen, and so it was important to separate. They don't really find inspiration in Marx, and they didn't find it in the party line early on, but they tend to point out that Stalin was their most sympathetic listener. And some have pointed out that's because Stalin was himself from a minority, a Georgian, and that he recognized the claim that African Americans were making at that time, that they were an oppressed people within a nation, and that it was not possible to integrate into that burning house in a way that was satisfying and attentive to the issues of black people. So in the interesting history of the United States and attempts for emancipation or greater freedom, that it's a mixed bag in relationship of nationalism to issues of class, and the idea that it's possible to integrate with the proletariat in a way that would be satisfactory for African Americans, or the extent to which even the proletariat, the white working classes, would continue to gain a psychological wage by distancing themselves from black workers. And that's an ongoing legacy, and you might say that it imprinted in very strange ways, that it seems uncanny the extent to which things seem to be repeating. So it's strange as a teacher to ask one's students how much have things changed since 1968 or earlier on, or since the time of slavery. And you get two reactions. You get those who blithely say that there's no comparison at all, that things are rosy now and they were terrible then. But there are a lot of my students, our students at Morehouse, traditionally black college, who suggest, and I'm sympathetic with that structurally things are uncannily the same, and that it hasn't changed that much. I'm of two minds on that. I recognize the progress, but I also recognize and am frustrated by the lack of progress heretofore. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Jensen, for a wonderful lecture. And I think your concluding note was also very appropriate. Thank you all for your attention and participation. Till we meet again after tea.
Thank you, Professor Gupta and Professor Jensen.